Guys, welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about how defense mechanisms can create really toxic cycles in relationships, especially parent-child relationships, but really could happen in any sort of close dyad, partner-partner, partner-friend, even coworker-coworker, and how these cycles and defense mechanisms can cause a lot of chronic shame to start happening for the person who's receiving a lot of projection. Before I get into it, I did actually post a short about this topic, but this is the reason why I don't love shorts, is that it's very difficult to condense topics like these into something very short, so I said scratch that, I want to start over and do it more in depth this time, because I really don't think I explained it very well in the short. In fact, I think I was misleading. So let's get into it. What are the defense mechanisms and the dynamics that can come forward and create a lot of shame for people? So most of us have heard of the defense mechanism called projection, which is when a person unconsciously attributes an unwanted part of themselves to someone else. So for instance, let's say that a mother is chronically cruel. She tends to gossip, she tends to be mean to people, and she's not aware of that about herself. It's not in her conscious realm of knowledge. And instead of taking responsibility or look that in the face, she projects that onto her daughter. So let's say that her daughter is sharing something that happened at school. The mom might say to her, "You're so mean. Why are you being so mean to your friend?" Paranoia is often considered a form of projection as well. People who are highly paranoid that other people are going to try to get them tend to misattribute their own aggressive impulses. And when I say their own aggressive impulses, I don't mean that they're necessarily super aggressive people. We all have some level of aggressive impulses, but when we don't take responsibility for our own, we tend to project those onto others. For instance, let's say that a cheater is paranoid about being cheated on. That would be a form of projection. Projection is what people do when there's something that's too painful for them to look in the face about themselves, when they don't have the psychological resources to cope with certain truths about themselves. And so instead of looking those in the face, it's kind of like a hot potato. They try to put that on someone else, anyone else. Projection happens so frequently because they're consciously aware of the thing they're projecting about, right? Like the example with the mom who's conscious of cruelty existing in the world. And it's actually at the very forefront of her mind because unconsciously, she is very aware that she's a cruel person. But instead of seeing it in herself, she sees it in everybody else because, like I said, it's at the forefront of her mind. A lot of people, like I said, have heard of projection, but not as many have heard of something called projective identification. This is a little bit more complex. So whereas projection is something you're not conscious of about yourself that you project onto other people, projective identification, when someone is called out on it, they can acknowledge consciously, yeah, I do take part in this trait. So when they're called out on it, like when you say, "No, David, I'm not cheating on you. Actually, let me remind you that you cheated on me a few months ago." David can acknowledge, yeah, that's true. But once they're called out on it, they find a way to blame the person who's calling them out on it. So David might say, "Well, yeah, I did cheat on you, but I cheated on you because I was worried you would cheat on me." They find a way to somehow attribute the thing they're projecting about to the person they're projecting on. And projection does a little bit of this too, but projective identification does a really good job of making the projectee feel what the projector feels. So whereas projection might be David makes you feel like a cheater because he himself is a cheater, projective identification would be more like David makes you feel paranoid about being cheated on because he himself is paranoid about being cheated on. Okay, so how does this affect the person that is receiving the projection? As humans, we are built to be able to absorb things from other people. We are very interdependent, no matter how much society these days is trying to push a very individualistic, separatist mindset. Having some level of porosity to be able to absorb from others is what helps us grow, learn, take accountability, become aware of faults that we may have, feel inspired by others, feel challenged by others. It's what helps us exist as human beings. We are born with this ingrained capacity to internalize what others are projecting onto us. This can be a healthy thing. In fact, it is necessary in order to develop a healthy personality. For instance, when we're infants, we need to internalize the mother's projection of soothing in order to be able to self-soothe later on. Without a caregiver who is very soothing, we can't develop that capacity to self-soothe because we can't internalize her. When people say like, oh, babies, they just have to cry it out, you don't have to give in to them, you don't have to be there for them, that is actually very harmful. You're not showing babies how to learn to self-soothe. They need to learn that through another person first. They need to internalize that from another person. Only then can it become an automatic part of them. Projection can definitely be positive, and actually it is necessary. But it can also be harmful in a lot of ways. And that is when someone is projecting sort of psychological toxins onto us. They're not projecting things that help us. They're projecting things that they don't want to take responsibility for, that causes harm to internalize. So there are three main ways that we internalize what other people project onto us. One is incorporation. And this is a very undeveloped form of internalizing. It's basically when you don't see the difference between you and others yet. Like in infancy, when you don't have a self-other differentiation yet, you kind of see yourself and the whole world as one blob. For instance, a baby drinking a mother's milk after she's been drinking. That would be the baby sort of incorporating the toxins because they're literally merging with the milk. Another more adult example of this is a lot of Christians, when they go to church, they are symbolically ingesting the body and blood of Christ. That is also a form of incorporation. The second, more complex way of internalizing something is when you do see self-other differentiation. You can acknowledge that you are separate from the person projecting onto you. And this is called introjection. Introjection is basically the opposite of projection, is that absorption that I was talking about. And it's not accompanied by any sort of discernment or critical thinking. You're just kind of absorbing whatever gets thrown at you. So in childhood, if your mom says that you are a cruel child, chances are you might believe it. You might internalize that as part of your identity and then go on to think that you're a bad, cruel, mean person, and then wake up with a lot of shame in the morning. In fact, your early caregiver's voice, the way that they speak to you, often becomes the way that you speak to yourself. It becomes your internal monologue, and if you had a very critical parent, it becomes your inner critic. But introjection can also be positive. The way that introjection is created to cause these harmful cycles can also be used to undo those harmful cycles. A lot of people, for instance, when they have an inner critic that's very overactive, they go to the therapist, they hear the therapist's much more compassionate, empathic, gentle approach, and they start to sort of hear that therapist's voice inside their own head talking back to the inner critic. And then the third way of internalizing something is something called identification. And this is when you're taking in certain aspects of other people without introjecting uncritically. You're deciding what parts and pieces and values you want to internalize from other people and transforming it into something cohesive with you. So, for instance, it's no longer just that you're hearing your therapist's voice speaking to you, challenging your inner critic. Your inner critic has now softened to incorporate the therapist's voice. You yourself, your own internal monologue, has now incorporated aspects of the therapist's voice, but it is now a part of you. And the important piece here is that it is selective. If you entirely identify with everything that your therapist says and does and identifies with, then you're basically just uncritically taking everything about them as your own. That's not healthy. It's healthy to decide for yourself what parts are helpful to keep and what parts you can sort of relinquish. That's why a lot of therapy clients or a lot of people who are in recovery, for instance, will, after they heal, after they sort of identify with their therapist or their AA coach's voice, they want to go on to become like that person. They want to become a therapist. They want to become an AA coach, which in some cases might be a good idea. In some cases, maybe it's not necessary for their healing. Maybe there are logistical reasons why it's not the best idea, but they've so entirely identified with that person that they're not being as selective about what values to keep and which ones to take away. So you see how in harmful dynamics this cycle forms of projection or projective identification and absorption or introjection or identification. So the person doing the projecting, whether or not they're aware of it, they are rejecting unwanted parts of themselves, throwing it onto someone else. And the person receiving that is internalizing it. They're absorbing it. They're taking it as their own. If they have a healthy ability to absorb from other people, which is great. It's what allows for empathy. It's what allows for self-growth, for accountability. But when they're absorbing a whole lot of toxins, a whole lot of shame from someone else, that can obviously result in a lot of shame that's not theirs to keep. It's not their shame that they're carrying, and yet they're carrying it. Now, the cycle is made worse if the person doing the projecting also employs other defense mechanisms that tend to be not very evolved. One of them is called splitting. This is when you see things in either all good or all bad terms. So for instance, let's say that your mom comes home in a really bad mood because something bad happened at work. Something minor it could be. But because of that minor trigger, she sees herself as all bad. Maybe she sees you as all bad. She sees her coworkers as all bad. The world at large is all bad. So for whatever reason, you in that moment as the child are all bad in her eyes. And you receive that projected onto you and you internalize it. If this happens enough times, then you go on to develop an all bad view of yourself chronically. It becomes a part of your identity. Another unhelpful defense mechanism that can accompany projection is idealization and devaluation. This is similar to splitting, but it is slightly different. It's when a person sees themselves as either perfect, so idealized, or worthless or devalued. And they see the other person in the scenario as the opposite of that. So for instance, a mom might come home, feel really devalued about herself because of something that happened at work, and then the child, through contrast, is idealized, is all good. Or she might see herself as idealized because she got some praise at work, and then the child becomes devalued. She goes, "Why didn't you do what I asked of you? You always do this. Why can't you do anything right? What do you mean you got a B+ on this? Why does your hair look so oily?" etc. Now, even if your mom comes home and she's devaluing herself, thereby idealizing you, that can be really confusing and destabilizing to be on the receiving end of. Imagine how it feels for a child to hear this from a parent. "You're so perfect, you can do no wrong, you're so much smarter than me, so much prettier, you're so amazing, you're brilliant, you're a genius." Can you see how that would, first of all, inflate your self-esteem? Secondly, give you a really unrealistic and undialectical view of yourself where you're not incorporating the good and the bad of yourself. And third, be even more confusing if your parent unpredictably shifts between idealizing and devaluing you, where you're left wondering, hold on, am I all good or am I all bad? Am I the worst person in the world or the best person in the world? In reality, you're neither. You're a combination of those two. You're somewhere in the middle, but because someone is using these very primitive defense mechanisms, you are internalizing that very black and white worldview. And so you might go on to, in your adult life, develop this mindset that if one little thing goes wrong, the whole world comes crashing down, you're the worst person in the world. Or if one thing goes right, have a very idealized, grandiose view of yourself. So we talked about the defense mechanisms, we talked about the cycle, how it's projected, how it's internalized. How does a person on the receiving end of these sorts of defense mechanisms heal from this toxic cycle? First of all, you have to remember that your ability to absorb from other people is a good thing. It's a healthy thing. It's what helps you develop as a person. Probably what makes you a self-aware, empathic human being. Imagine the kind of person that is immune to absorbing things from other people. You tell them that they hurt your feelings and they go, no, I didn't do that. I don't accept that. I didn't hurt your feelings. You tell them that you had a bad day and you're wanting them to join you in your sadness and they just can't do it. They say, oh no, I'm not letting you bring me down. I had an awesome day. No, I'm not getting in the mud with you. I actually have met people who are the opposite of absorbers. They literally just will not absorb any external information. If you tell them that they did something wrong, they don't accept that. If you remind them of something that they did that is not within their conscious mind, there's a refusal to examine that you could be right and they could be wrong. It doesn't matter how well you say it or what you say, how you try to phrase it, it's just not going to get through. They're not listening, they don't care, they're not empathizing, they don't want their perspective questioned at all. There's just no ability to absorb. So it's a good thing that you're capable of absorbing from other people. With that being said, there comes a point where anything taken to an extreme is not helpful. And if you're around someone that tends to project those psychological toxins, like I was talking about, it's going to be really harmful for you. If you're constantly feeling really bad about yourself around a certain person, or you're developing chronic shame about yourself and you're not sure where it's coming from, there's a good chance someone in your life, probably someone close to you or someone in your early childhood, has projected onto you in unhealthy ways. Once you identify the person or the people doing this, you have to become less porous. You have to absorb less. Be less like a sponge and more like a mirror. Probably more like the person actually doing the projecting. Reflect it back. Be less absorptive. How does this look in practice? Well, when you start to feel bad about yourself in a conversation with someone, the very first step is honestly asking yourself, is this person projecting onto me? If you're very used to just absorbing whatever comes your way, it's going to take a minute to get in the habit of practicing this. A while ago, I was talking to someone, and over the course of our conversation, I kept feeling more and more ashamed about myself. This person kept implying to me that I wasn't being empathic about something towards someone else. And I was starting to get really confused because I did feel empathy towards the person in question. And I was really doubting my sense of reality. I was thinking, hold on, am I being unempathic? Am I an unempathic person? I have been empathic towards the person in question. I've done X, Y, and Z for them. Why do I feel so bad about myself right now? And later, it occurred to me that this person kept repeating, we need to be empathic towards this person, we need to be empathic, because they were trying to tell themselves that. They themselves unconsciously recognized that they were having difficulties empathizing with this other person. But instead of being in touch with their emotions and taking responsibility for that, it was less painful to just throw that on someone else. You need to be more empathic was basically them saying to themselves, I need to be more empathic. Then, once you recognize, okay, this person is projecting onto me based on whatever scenario is going on with them in their personal life, reflect like a mirror. Don't absorb those psychological toxins as your own because they are not yours to keep. Instead, throw it back on them. How does this look in practice? Well, it could look like saying, Daniela, you keep telling me to be more empathic, but I've done X, Y, and Z empathic thing for this person. Are you having difficulties empathizing with them? Or you could say, hey John, I'm struggling to understand this email you sent me that implies I'm not holding up my end of the group project. I've done 7 slides and I notice you've only done 1 of them. Or, no David, I won't let you accuse me of cheating. You are the one who cheated on me 2 months ago. And be fully prepared for this person to not absorb it back. They put that on you because they can't handle it. They're not going to take it back in. Point is not for you to force it down their throat because that probably will not work, and honestly, why would you even want to? Point is to reflect it off of yourself so that you can maintain healthy self-esteem, get rid of the shame that is attached to that projection. And something else that's really important, I kind of alluded to this earlier by talking about internalizing a therapist's voice. It's really important to surround yourself with people who are healthy for you, who project healthy things onto you, who are able to absorb equally, and whose voices you can introject in order to strengthen yourself. For every person that you allow to be in your close quarters, ask yourself, would I mind if my inner monologue spoke to me the way this person speaks to me? If not, you have a really important question to ask yourself then, which is, why am I letting this person into my life? You're at big risk of introjecting their voice, whether you like it or not. So in summary, because I know we covered a lot today, projection is when someone unconsciously puts an unwanted trait onto you. Projective identification is when someone consciously puts an unwanted trait onto you, or blames you for what they're projecting, or makes you feel the way that they feel. We as humans are built to internalize information from other people. So when someone projects onto us, we tend to introject or to absorb or to internalize what they are projecting, especially if we're vulnerable. Like, especially if we're very young or if we're in love or there's a power differential. A cycle forms where the other person projects and we absorb their projection. If the person projecting onto us also uses defense mechanisms like splitting or idealization and devaluation, that is an additional layer of risk for seeing ourselves as all bad. The key is to have a healthy amount of porosity. Allow yourself to absorb some things, but not all. Recognize the people who frequently project in unhealthy ways and reflect that back to them. Surround yourself with people who are healthier for you. Let me know what you thought about this video. Just as a reminder, I do have a mental health journal out if you want to check it out. I'll put the link in the description box, and see you soon.